So we finally made it to the end of a summer-long series that we've been in here at Zion on the book of Genesis. And actually, last weekend, PK began with the last story in the book of Genesis, which is the story of the life and times of a guy named Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph actually takes up a lot of real estate at the end of the book of Genesis, 14 whole chapters. And so PK kicked off the story. Today, we're going to finish the story. We're going to finish the book of Genesis, and we're going to finish this series. But before we do all of that, let me just back up a little bit and give you the backstory to Joseph's story, just in case you weren't here last weekend. So we first meet Joseph in Genesis 37. He's a young man of 17 years old. And he's actually the youngest of 11 sons that a guy named Jacob has. And they're all living together, the whole family, in a region called Canaan, which today is known as the nation of Israel. And so Joseph, he's the youngest of these 11 sons, and he's kind of the baby of the family. Now, if you were the baby of the family, or maybe if you were part of a family that kind of had the baby of the family, you know that sometimes babies of the family can get kind of, what's a good word for it? Spoiled? Is that a good word for it? Because sometimes they can get away with stuff that nobody else in the family can get away with, and this was Joseph in spades. In fact, as kind of a symbol of his spoiling, some of you may know this, his father Jacob gave him a very famous gift. This is Genesis 37, verse 3. His father made an ornate robe for him. If you grew up in church, you've probably heard this as Joseph's coats of many colors. But however you describe it, the implication and the indication of this gift is clear. Joseph is the baby of the family. Joseph is spoiled, and Joseph is his father's favorites. Joseph gets all the best gifts, all the best things from his daddy. Now, it's great if you're your father's favorite, but if you're not, it's annoying. Which means that there were 10 other brothers of Joseph for whom this was really annoying. And their annoyance eventually began to morph into a little bit of antipathy, and their antipathy eventually began to morph into a little bit of outright anger, and their anger eventually results in some very bad action. The story goes like this, just a few verses later in Genesis 37. These 10 sons, these 10 brothers are out watching sheep in a pasture one day because that was the family business. They were all ranchers, and everybody's there except for Joseph, because Joseph doesn't have to be there because he's his father's favorite and he can do whatever he wants to do. So while they're working, Joseph is sleeping. He finally shows up in the pasture one day around, the crack of noon or whenever he shows up. And when his brothers see their little brother coming toward them, they finally decide that they've had enough. Joseph has been spoiled enough, and he's been getting away with murder for all of these years, and so they decide that they're going to murder him. They hatch a plan to do it. Genesis 37, verse 20, they say to each other, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns that we use to water the sheep. And we're going to tell our father that a ferocious animal devoured him." And so they're ready to go with this plan, and they would have actually gone through with this plan if it wasn't for one of these sons, one of these brothers, whose name was Judah. Because Judah starts thinking about this, and he thinks about a problem with this plan. Genesis 37, verse 26, he says to his brothers, guys, what are we going to gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Like if we were hitmen, we'd be paid to do this kind of thing. You know what? I want to get paid. And so maybe we need to go a different direction. How about we do this? Verse 27, "Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him." Now, you need to know this on background. The Ishmaelites were kind of like ancient versions of traveling pawn kings. They would go from place to place, and you could buy stuff from the Ishmaelites and sell stuff to the Ishmaelites. You could trade stuff with the Ishmaelites. You could do that with stuff, but you could also do it with human beings. You could buy and sell slaves from the Ishmaelites. They were like history's first human traffickers. And so Judah says, what if we just sell our brother into slavery to the Ishmaelites? After all, Judah continues, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Well, how magnanimous of him. He's not going to slaughter him. He's just going to sell him into slavery. And so when the Ishmaelite merchants just happened to come by in the middle of this sheep pasture in the middle of nowhere, this is kind of like the ice cream truck in summer. You never knew when the Ishmaelites were just going to show up. Here they come. The brothers see their opportunity. his brothers pulled up Joseph out of the cistern, and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites. Now, this is both horrific and pathetic, all at the same time, and here's why. The going rate for a slave in this day was about 30 shekels of silver. Joseph's brothers sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. In other words, they're so desperate to get rid of him, they sell him for 30% off. And they're happy because they finally got rid of daddy's spoiled favorite. And the Ishmaelites are happy because they just got a great deal on a brand new slave. And what do the Ishmaelites do? The very end of verse 28, they take him down to Egypt, where because they got such a great deal on a slave, they sell him again, probably this time at full price, to a man in Egypt whose name is Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was actually a government official in ancient Egypt. He was kind of a high-flying, highfalutin, high-powered government official. His official title was the captain of the guard. Now, in our day and age, we would kind of think of this as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This guy was so powerful that he was the highest-ranking military official in ancient Egypt. And so he was always at meetings. He was always trying to figure out Egypt and its army and how to protect the nation, which meant that he was not home a lot, so he needed someone to kind of manage his household because he wasn't around to do it, which is why he buys Joseph to do that for him. Now, it turns out that Mrs. Potiphar didn't really like her husband's job all that much because he was always gone, always at work, always in meetings with Pharaoh, and she begins to get a little lonely and a little frustrated. And all of a sudden, she sees this brand new household slave who's the manager of the household, who's pretty good looking, by the way. And so she begins to try to seduce him. And Joseph actually does the right thing. He rebuffs her seductions, but that only gets him in trouble. Because she's now a woman scorned, and she's not happy. And so she goes around and she begins to accuse Joseph of trying to do to her what she tried to do to him. She accuses Joseph of trying to seduce her and even trying to forcibly be with her. Well, when word of this makes it back to Mr. Potiphar understandably is not very happy. And so check this out. Joseph actually loses his job as a slave. You got to mess up big time to lose your job as a slave. But that's what Joseph does. And he gets thrown into an Egyptian dungeon. And he actually would have languished away in there forever if it wasn't for the Pharaoh of Egypt himself. Because many years later, the Pharaoh of Egypt begins to have these kind of odd dreams. And the Pharaoh of Egypt believes that these odd dreams are actually omens of something that is to come. And he's heard about this guy who's languishing away in one of his dungeons named Joseph. Because it turns out that Joseph can do this weird little trick. He has this ability to interpret dreams, to tell people if their dreams mean something, and if they mean something, what it is that they mean. Joseph had become very famous for doing this on the inside of an Egyptian dungeon because he had done it for other prisoners, and his fame kind of precedes him. And so what Pharaoh does is he actually pulls Joseph out of the Egyptian dungeon, and he says to him, I've heard about you. I've heard that you're good at interpreting dreams, and I've been having these weird dreams, and I want you to tell me if these dreams mean something, and if they mean something, what is it that they mean? And so Joseph says, okay, fine, I'll give it my best try. And so Pharaoh launches into describing these dreams. He says, in this one dream I'm having, I see these cows in a pasture, and there are like 7 of them, and they're really good-looking cows. They're fat cows. I see these cows, and I say ribeye, because that's how good they look. They're amazing. But then I look across the pasture just a little ways, and all of a sudden I see 7 more cows, but these 7 cows are the opposite of the first 7 cows that I see. They're gaunt, they're emaciated. You can see all of their bones. They're starving to death, and they look like they're getting ready to fall over and die. And the strangest thing, Pharaoh says, happens in my dreams. These cows, these 7 gaunt cows, they all of a sudden become cow carnivores. In fact, more than that, they become cow cannibals because they go over to the 7 really fat cows and they eat them all up. That's like a lot of beef, but it's so strange because even after having this giant meal, the 7 gaunt cows don't get any less gaunt. They look just as emaciated as ever. And then I have this other dream where I'm walking through a field and I see these heads of grain, and there are 7 heads of grain too. And they're gorgeous heads of grain. These are the kind of heads of grain that I see in a Kellogg's cereal commercial, okay? I walk through this field. It's so beautiful. I'm singing for amber waves of grain. That's how amazing it is. But then I just walk a little further in the field, and all of a sudden, I get to this other section of a field where I see 7 more heads of grain. And these 7 heads of grain, these second 7 heads of grain, they look like a lawn in Wahlberg after a summer like this. They're completely scorched. They're just flat out dead. But then the weirdest thing happens in my dream. These 7 scorched heads of grain go over to the 7 good heads of grain, and they eat them up. But the 7 scorched heads of grain don't become any less scorched. Joseph, Pharaoh says, can you tell me what these dreams mean? To which Joseph responds, well, yeah, I think I can. So the 7 really good cows that you saw, and the 7 really good heads of grain that you saw, those are actually symbols for the next 7 years in Egypt. Because the next 7 years in Egypt, man, they are going to be good. Your economy is going to be booming. Your stock market's going to be a bull market. Everything is going to be up and to the right. And Egypt is going to become the breadbasket of like the whole world. You're going to be growing so much grain, people aren't going to be able to eat it all. Animals aren't going to be able to consume it all. It's going to be the best 7 years Egypt has ever seen. But then the strangest thing is going to happen after 7 years. It's going to be like somebody flips a switch, and the bottom of the economy, your economy, Pharaoh, is going to fall out. The stock market's going to crash. A drought is going to sweep over the land. A famine is going to come over the land. All that grain that has been grown on all that land is now going to lie fallow. And those 7 emaciated cows that you saw, they're not going to have any food to eat, and so they're going to die. And by the way, Pharaoh, if you're not careful, your people are going to die. That famine is going to kill you and me. It's going to be so bad unless you start planning now. And so Joseph continues, and he says, not to be presumptuous, but I do have an idea that maybe we might want to try. How about we do this? For the next 7 years, since the next 7 years are going to be so good, and we're going to be growing like lots of stuff, lots of grain, how about for the next 7 years, we levy a tax on grain? Let's call it like a 20% tax, okay? People grow 10 stalks of grain, we take 2 stalks of grain. And we'll build all of these barns and all of these storehouses because there's going to be so much grain, we're going to need a place to store it all. And for the next 7 years, you're going to make a lot of money in taxes just by taxing this grain and then storing this grain. And then after 7 years, when the bottom of the economy falls out, here's what we'll do. We'll sell back to the people what we first taxed from the people at an elevated rate so that they will be able to have something to eat. And so check this out, Pharaoh, okay? You're going to make money on this grain 1 time when you tax it from them, and then 2 times when you sell it back to them. Now, if you give any government official any scheme where they can make money on your money twice, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to sign up for that, and Pharaoh's like, this is the best idea I've ever heard. In fact, he's so impressed with the idea that he puts Joseph in charge of the plan. In fact, he actually makes him second in command to only Pharaoh. And so Joseph has gone from being a slave that lost his job as a slave and thrown into a dungeon. So he's gone from being a prisoner to the prime minister of Egypt. And just like Joseph predicts, the next 7 years in Egypt are amazing. Everything goes great. But also, just like Joseph predicts, after 7 years, it's like somebody flips a switch. And the bottom of the economy just falls out. And a drought comes over the nation, a famine sweeps over the land, and this famine becomes so bad, it becomes so acute that it not only affects the nation of Egypt, it affects areas that are surrounding the nation of Egypt, including an area about 250 miles to the northeast called Canaan, where a father named Jacob is living with his sons, who are now -1. Now, Jacob and his sons, they're starving to death. But Jacob has heard about this man in Egypt who has this plan. And he doesn't know who it is. He doesn't know that it's Joseph. He doesn't know that it's his son. But he's heard about this man. And so he says to his sons, hey guys, we got to get some food or we're going to die. So I need you guys to take a trek about 250 miles to the southwest, to the nation of Egypt, and find this man who came up with this fantastic plan and buy some grain from him. And so that's what they do. They find their long-lost brother, except that it's been 23 years by this point since they've seen their long-lost brother, so they don't even recognize Joseph as their long-lost brother. But here's the catch. Even though they don't recognize him, Joseph recognizes them. And they go through all this stuff. The brothers go and they buy some grain from their brother who they don't know is their brother. They take it back to their father. They run out of grain. They come back again. They try to buy some more grain from this guy. And finally, after buying grain a couple of times, Joseph decides that it's time to reveal who he is to them. And so finally, in Genesis 45, verse 3, Joseph says to his brothers, hey guys, you need to know something about me. This man with this magnificent plan who's saving your life, well, I'm Joseph. I'm your brother. I'm the one who you sold into slavery. Now, I love Joseph's brothers' reaction to him. His brothers, the text says, were not able to answer him. Why? Because they were terrified. And of course they were. Because the last time they had seen their brother was 23 years earlier when they were doing something very sinister. And now Joseph has become the prime minister of Egypt. And here's what they're scared of. Here's what they're worried about. They're worried that he's going to use his clout to take them out. But he doesn't. Instead, he says to him, Genesis 45, verse 5, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Joseph says to his brothers, you don't have to be afraid of me. I'm here to help you, not to hurt you. Now, just because Joseph says this doesn't mean his brothers believe this. They're still a little suspicious. Maybe he's just waiting. Maybe he's just waiting to pounce and destroy us, hurt us, pay us back, get us back. And so the next 5 chapters in the book of Genesis are basically Joseph trying to convince them that he's really for them, until finally we get to those words in Genesis 50 that we read earlier in the service. Genesis 50, verse 19. He says to his brothers again, guys, you don't have to be afraid. I mean, come on. Am I in the place of God? As for you, I know you meant evil against me. But God meant all this for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So, again, let me say this again. You don't have to be afraid. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you and for your little ones. Thus, Joseph comforted them, and he spoke kindly to them. Now, you need to understand something about Joseph's words here to his brothers. Joseph, when he says these words, he doesn't just pull these words out of thin air. In fact, Joseph, when he behaves this way toward his brothers, he's not just behaving this way toward his brothers because he wants to. Joseph gets his words and his behavior actually from a rule. It's a very famous rule. You've probably heard of it before. In fact, it's most famously articulated by a man who lives about 1900 years after Joseph, named Jesus. Here's the way that Jesus articulates this very famous rule, Matthew 7, verse 12. He says, in everything. And by the way, those first two words are important because here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, this is not just a rule that you follow when you want to in some situations. In most situations, in situations where it's convenient for you, this is a rule that I want you to follow in every situation. In everything, Jesus says, I want you to do to others what you would have them do to you. Now, this rule is so famous, we have a name for it. We call it a certain kind of rule. What do we call it? We call it the Golden Rule. And this is the rule that Joseph follows. He does unto others, he does unto his brothers what he would want them to do unto him. But here's the thing that makes Joseph so amazing. Even though they haven't done it unto him. That's why Joseph says, in Genesis 50, verse 21, I got you. I'm going to provide for you and your little ones. I'm going to take care of you and your family regardless of the way that you have treated me, because I want to do unto you as I would have you do unto me, even though you haven't done it unto me. Now, let's be honest about something. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes for a second. If somebody sold you into slavery, even if 23 years had passed, would you struggle to do what Joseph does with his brothers? Anybody in here? I kind of think I would. And so the question that I want to wrestle to the ground in the time that we have remaining in this message is how does Joseph manage to pull this off? Because just psychologically and emotionally and relationally, what Joseph does here isn't easy. You know, Joseph understands something theologically that gives him the ability to follow this rule, this golden rule. Here's what Joseph understands theologically, and this is critical. He understands that even if he wants to, he can't do God's job for him. Joseph understands that even if he wants to, even if he'd like to, he can't do God's job for him. You know, when somebody doesn't do unto us what we want them to do unto us, we have a reflexive reaction. And it's not the golden rule. You know what the reflexive reaction is? Revenge. You know this. You see this. And kids, grandkids, one kid hits the other kid. What does the other kid do? Hits the first kid back. One kid yells at another kid. What does the other kid do? They yell at them back. That's the way that it works. And it's not just little kids who do that. It's adults who do that. We like to get revenge. But here's what we need to realize. When it comes to revenge, even if we think we're good at it, we're actually really bad at it. Revenge, actually, according to the Bible, is not our job. It's God's job. And Joseph understands that we shouldn't try to do God's job for him. Romans 12, verse 19 puts it like this: do not take revenge, Don't do it. But instead, leave room for God to do his job. Leave room for his wrath, for it is written, I'm going to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. Revenge is my job. And don't try to do my job for me. Here's the reason we're so bad at revenge. We tend to make revenge synonymous with retaliation. Those two words are basically the same in our mind. That's why if somebody hits us, we want to hit them back. What is that? It's retaliation. If somebody shouts at us, we want to shout at them back. What is that? It's retaliation. But that's not all revenge is, theologically or honestly, even grammatically. I want to do a little bit of word work here with you, okay? And I want to show you a little history of the word revenge, okay? The word revenge actually comes from a Latin word, vindicare. We get an English word from this, vindication. You heard of that word before? Now, the word vindicare in Latin actually comes from an even older Greek word, which is in the middle of the Latin word, dice. We get the Greek word dice. You pronounce it dike, not dice. Dike, and dike in Greek means righteousness. And so here's what vengeance can look like. It can look like taking something that is wrong and making it right. It can look like taking something that is wicked and making it righteous. Revenge doesn't just look like retaliation. Revenge can also look like vindication. And when God gets revenge, when God offers vengeance, this is the way that he offers it. And this is the way that he gets it, because God's an expert at taking what has gone wrong and making it right. That's why when somebody gets sick, that goes wrong. What do we pray for? We pray for God to make it right by healing them. It's vindication. When somebody is lonely and isolated, what do we pray for? We pray for God to be with them, to make it right. It's vindication. When God's Son was killed on a cross, what does God do? He raises him from the dead. He makes it right. It's vindication. And when Joseph comes to realize and recognize this, he also realizes and recognizes that there's no way that he can do that kind of vengeance, that kind of revenge for God, because he can't take what's wrong and just snap his fingers and make it right. That's why he says to his brothers, Genesis 50, verse 19, am I in the place of God? Do I occupy the C-suite in heaven? I can't go back and take all the wrongs that have been done against me and make them right. I can't go back and get those years back that I was languishing away in a dungeon. I can't go back and get Mrs. Potiphar not to accuse me. I can't go back and get you not to sell me into slavery, but I know someone who can, and I know someone who has. As for you, Joseph says, you wanted to do evil against me, but God made it right. He meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, even as they are today. The whole world would have died in starvation and in misery, Joseph says, if you guys wouldn't have sold me into slavery. But now God has vindicated me, because he's taken what is wrong and he's made it all right. And all right doesn't mean okay. This is not A-L-R-I-G-H-T. This is A-L-L-R-I-G-H-T. He's made everything right. And so, Joseph says, now I can do what's right. I can follow the rules. In fact, more than that, I can follow the rule. You know, the one that's golden. I can do unto you what I would want you to do unto me, even when you haven't done it unto me. Let me ask you a question. What would happen if you followed the golden rule like that? What would happen if you lived like Joseph? Now, while you're thinking about that, let me just give you something else to think about. Joseph had a lot of wrong done to him. But the wrong that was done to Joseph doesn't hold a candle to the wrong that was done to Jesus. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers for 20 shekels of silver. Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples, not just into slavery, but unto death, for 30 pieces of silver. Joseph's brothers didn't recognize him after 23 years of not seeing him. One of Jesus' disciples, named Peter, he didn't recognize him or pretended not to recognize him after just a few hours of not seeing him. While Jesus is on trial and Peter's watching from afar to see what's going to happen to Jesus, people begin to ask him, "Do you know this guy? Do you recognize this guy?" To which Peter says, "Nope." Joseph's brothers despised him because he was his father's favorite son. Jesus' enemies wanted to destroy him because he claimed to be God's one and only son. Joseph was left for dead in a cistern. Jesus was put to death on a cross. Joseph's life was bad. Jesus' death was much worse. And yet, it's so interesting. Years after Jesus was put to death and after he rose again, one of his followers, the guy named Peter, the same guy who pretended not to recognize Jesus, is reflecting back on that trial and what he saw on that night. And he writes about it in a little book that we have at the back of our New Testament, 1 Peter. He writes about what he saw and how Jesus reacted and responded when nobody was doing unto him what he would have wanted them to do unto him. 1 Peter 2, verse 23, he says, when I was watching this trial, when his accusers hurled insult at him, what didn't he do? He didn't retaliate. He didn't turn revenge into simple retaliation. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, here's what he did. He entrusted himself to him. That's to God, who judges righteously. He believed that in the end, God was going to make it all right so he could simply do what's right. Jesus didn't try to do God's job for him, which is crazy when you think about it, because Christians confess and believe that Jesus is God. And he still let God vindicate him. And here's what this means for us, Peter says in verse 24. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and do this. Live for righteousness. We might trust in a God who will make it all right so we can do what's right. We can do unto others what we would want them to do unto us, even when they don't do it unto us. So let me ask you the question again. What would happen if you lived that way? What would happen if you lived that way with your kids or your grandkids? You ever notice that kids can press all your buttons? What would happen if when they got angry at you, you didn't get angry at them back? but instead you practice patience? What would happen if you did unto them what you wanted them to do unto you? What would that do? Or maybe for you, the problem's at work. You got that one coworker, the really annoying one who's just a little too ambitious, and he's stepping on other people to climb a corporate ladder. What would happen if instead of responding to him with your ambition, what would happen if you responded to him instead with humility, and you did unto him what you wanted him to do unto you? What would that do? What would happen if you did this with your friends? Maybe even your friends in church. This happens sometimes in churches, not in this church, but in some churches. You may have heard of this before, where people get crossways with each other. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Ever heard of such a thing? People get angry at each other. Sometimes they gossip about each other. What would happen if, like, you had a dear friend and they started gossiping about you, and instead of just gossiping about them back, what if while they were cutting you down, you were building them up? What if you did unto them what you wanted them to do unto you? What would that do? You'll never know unless you try. So give it a try. Now, one more thing I need to say before we wrap up, and then I'm done, I promise. The golden rule is golden, but it's not magic. Sometimes you do unto others what you want them to do unto you, and they still don't do anything nice to you, right? They still respond poorly to you. Which, interestingly enough, is what happens to Joseph. So, very last verses of the book of Genesis. Joseph is living with his brothers as the prime minister in Egypt. He's also brought down his father, Jacob, and he's recently passed away. And they've all been living together in the nation of Egypt. And Joseph has saved his brothers' hides. He's kept them from starving to death, and he hasn't retaliated against them. And now Joseph is getting near the end of his life, and even though he's like the youngest of the brothers, it looks like he's getting ready to die first. And so at the very end of his life, Genesis 50, verse 24, he gathers his brothers, and he says to them, I'm about to die. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land. You're going to go back to the land of Canaan. And here's why. God has promised it on oath to our great-grandfather Abraham, to our grandfather Isaac, and to our daddy Jacob. And now I want you to make a promise to me. I want you to make an oath to me. I've been away from home for a long time. And so I want you, second half of verse 25, to carry my bones up from this place. In other words, I may die here, but I don't want to stay here. When I die, Joseph says, bury me in Canaan. So, Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, here's the very last line of the book of Genesis. He was placed in a coffin where? Where? In Egypt. You've got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. Joseph saved his brother's life. And all he had was one simple request of his brothers. When I die, don't leave me here, bury me elsewhere. Take me back to Canaan. But when he dies, they bury him where? In Egypt. They put him in a coffin where? In Egypt. There's a technical term for Joseph's brothers. They're twerps. I don't know what else to call them. And so here's the problem. The book of Genesis comes to an end, but it still has some loose ends. Because we're left with this question. Will God ever make this right? Will God ever make this all right? Because the dying man hasn't even gotten his dying wish. What's going to happen to Joseph and his remains? Well, what's going to happen to his brothers? You know, this is the end of the book of Genesis, but it's not the end of the story. There's more to the story. There's more about what happens to Joseph. There's more about what happens to his brothers. It comes in the next book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. And we're going to learn all about the rest of Joseph's story right here at Zion in the book of Exodus when we study it together. next summer. Let's stand and pray.